Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us as we continue the 2021 NACOLE webinar series. As you might already know, NACOLE is an organization that strives to create a community of support for independent civilian oversight entities that seek to make their local law enforcement agencies, jails, and prisons more transparent, accountable, and responsive to the communities they serve. As part of that effort, we developed our webinar series where for the last 7 years, we have brought you information on the practice of civilian oversight, innovations, and the important work being done in the arena of criminal justice reform. I am particularly glad that you have joined us today as we welcome Danielle Davis and Paul Smith from the National Network for Safe Communities to discuss the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice. Danielle Davis is a field advisor for the Intimate Partner Violence Intervention and Reconciliation teams at the National Network for Safe Communities, where she provides hands-on strategic advising and support for sites data management to project managers, law enforcement executives, community-based organizations, and other leadership at partner cities across the country. Danielle focuses her work on strategies to reduce gender-based violence and strengthen police community trust, particularly with survivors of intimate partner and sexual violence and communities further marginalized by race, ethnicity, and gender, and sexual identity, expression, and orientation. Paul David Smith is the Director of Reconciliation at the National Network for Safe Communities. He previously directed their Chicago Violence Reduction Strategy, an initiative seeking to dramatically reduce group and gang violence in the city of Chicago. Paul's prior work includes being the Public Safety Coordinator for the City of Chattanooga, where he was responsible for managing Chattanooga's group violence reduction strategy and coordinated with city officials, law enforcement, social service providers, and community members to develop and implement the strategy. He also served as the executive principal of the Howard Schools in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where he and his team made exceptional strides in student achievement and school transformation. Before I turn things over to today's speakers, I'd like to remind all of you that you have entered today's call in listen-only mode. During the session, you will have the ability to type any questions you might have. We will then pose those questions to our speakers towards the end of the session. Please also note that today's meeting is being recorded and will be made available at a later date. With that, I will hand it over to Paul and Danielle to tell us more about the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and the work that the National Network for Safe Communities is doing. And over to you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear us okay? Great. All right. So perfect. I think we can open up our presentation. So just let us know when you guys are able to see. All right there. I think it's showing in a different mode. So sorry, Cam, I might have to ask. Let's see if it might be possible to have it up on your screen.
Sure. Just give me 1 second and we'll pull that up for you.
Great. Thanks everyone for your patience.
Okay, let me just switch back over to my screen and then we'll be ready. Okay, there you go. Can you see the screen?
Perfect. All right. So I think I can kick it over to Paul then to start us off with just a quick overview of the National Network.
All right, Kim, next screen. So the National Network for Safe Communities was founded at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in 2009 by our boss, criminologist David Kennedy, and the former college president, Jeremy Travis. NNSC is an action research center that partners closely with community leaders, law enforcement, social services, outreach and support providers, and other leaders within communities to develop scale and support cities around really the world in implementing evidence-based strategies to reduce violence, minimize arrests, reduce incarceration, and ultimately empower impacted communities. The NNSC, our approach has demonstrated that communities and public safety institutions working together can drive rapid and dramatic reductions in violence pertaining to groups, intimate partners, drug markets, prisons, individuals with guns, and more. And also, and which will be the crux of this conversation today, repair harm, build mutual trust, and strengthen legitimacy in public safety institutions. So that's a little bit about who we are and where we work. And so let's get on with our presentation today. Next slide. All right, so as you can see from the data that's here on the presentation, we know from research that people focus their attention very directly on their views about how fairly the police exercise authority in different communities. That refers to really 4 different aspects in the exercise of police authority. One is voice. People feel that police listen to them when they decide how to police their community, let them tell their side of the story, and when they're dealing with the police, give them a chance for input. The next would be neutrality. People want to believe that the police are making decisions, establishing policies based on facts, an impartial and fair way that doesn't discriminate. Third is respect. People want to know that the police treat them with respect, and citizens respect as people courtesy, dignity, that they are viewed as good citizens, decent human beings, not criminals or deviants, not suspects. It's important that the treatment they receive reflects that. And then fourth, that the police have trustworthy motives, that they're trying to do what is right for the people in their community. They're sincere in their efforts to do what's good for the people, and that they deal with them fairly. These 4 elements, voice, neutrality, respect, and trustworthy motives, are central to public judgments about how much people trust law enforcement. So an interesting point if we're talking about legitimacy is to note that even though the crime rate has declined dramatically in the last 20 years, public trust in the police has basically not changed. Even though communities have seen these dramatic declines in crime, they haven't seen increases in public trust in the police. So we know from research that one of the key findings is that public trust in the police is not related to just judgments about crime rate or judgments about the effectiveness of police in controlling crime. While they are a part of that factoring, people care if the police make fair and impartial decisions in the cases they deal with, and that those decisions are based on the law, not their personal biases. So a study by the Urban Institute, which is right here on the screen, found that fewer than 35% of people surveyed felt the police even try to help the people that they deal with. And then similarly, while legitimacy is a belief among people in the community that the police are entitled to exercise authority, entitled to make decisions about how to handle crime in their communities, they want police to behave accordingly and behave according to the law, and that they want the police to do the same things for their community. Again, the recent study by the Urban Institute found that only 43% of the people surveyed felt the police in their community are legitimate authorities. Next slide, Cami. So concerning legitimacy and violence prevention, research shows that perceptions of police legitimacy are lowest in communities most directly affected by serious violence. Community anger, distrust, silence are often misunderstood by law enforcement as tolerance for crime and violence, which is not true. But even in communities that experience the most violence, people overwhelmingly do respect the law. They want to be safe, and they want to work with the police. These same communities, however, historically do not trust the police, nor do they expect them to do the right thing. So American communities, especially communities of color, need to see law enforcement as fair, respectful, and on their side. So why is this important? Well, when police are perceived as legitimate, they are more likely to have community support, and community members are more likely to comply with law enforcement. So in these instances, people are more likely to come forward and testify, and more likely to call the police or 911 rather than take care of things themselves with street justice. Next slide, Cami.
So I'd like to spend a little bit of time here outlining the concept of harm. And we like to think at the National Network of two different types of harm. As Paul mentioned, our bread and butter, our origin story really is in violence prevention work. And when we think of violence, we often think of that as interpersonal harm, right? So there's an act of violence between two individuals, as displayed rather cheesily here through clip art. But these acts of violence can vary between gun violence and street violence. I work a lot with our intimate partner violence intervention, sexual violence. There are many forms of violence that can take place between individuals. And I think this is the concept of harm that is most familiar to most of us, right? That said, there's an element of restorative thinking that, and we'll get into a bit more about that later, but an element of restorative thinking and practice that centers around the impact of that harm between individuals to communities. Because the principle is that we are all inherently interconnected. So harm that takes place between individuals doesn't just stay there. It ripples out. It ripples out to kids in the home who experience violence, who maybe hear gunshots out or see, one parent beating another, right? That ripples out to their performance, maybe how they might act out in schools. It ripples out to victims of violence who, for a number of reasons, either can't show up to work because of stress, trauma, medical needs. Perpetrators of violence, those who cause that interpersonal harm, who can't attend because they are tied up in the criminal justice system. There's so many effects that ripple out to our broader communities. And restorative practice is very much about addressing those effects, not just between individuals, but also that impact on the community. Now, restorative practice, again, tends to focus on that interpersonal harm. So a lot of times when we hear the word restorative justice, it's connected to different court cases and, different victim offender dialogues or community circles relating to a specific instance of harm between individuals. Another element of restorative practice is where we focus, an area called institutional harm. And this is the area that you all, I know, are quite familiar with by virtue of your work in police accountability, because institutional harm has been an issue, fortunately one that is gaining greater attention and hopefully greater movement these days, but still not nearly where we need it to be. So when we talk about institutional harm, whereas interpersonal harm is harm that occurs between two individuals, interpersonal harm or institutional harm can occur within institutions, right? So it can be the harm of a police department or a DA's office telling a victim advocate agency that they're not allowed into an investigation or into questioning, right? That can be a form of institutional harm within agencies, or the disparities in funding between prosecutors' offices and public defenders' offices. These are examples of that harm within institutions. Institutions also perpetrate harm against individuals, right? So if there's an act of excessive force, of just disrespect, of brutality by a law enforcement agency against a member of the community, if it were just, Bob and Jim on the street, no badge, no nothing, then it would look more like that little icon over to the side. It's just between two individuals. But when one of those individuals wears a badge and carries a gun that is no longer just an interpersonal harm, that is inherently institutional, because that person represents and carries the weight and the power of an institution behind them. And unfortunately, over time, those harms, they become systematic and perpetrated against a wide number of individuals from certain communities. That becomes institutional harm against communities. And we've seen many communities speak out against this harm and to demand acknowledgement of that harm, that we tell the truth about what happened and admit that it was wrong. We've seen a lot of these communities also demand repair. There's increasing conversation about reparations in a number of forms, whether it's housing assistance, like was piloted in Evanston, that was announced a few months ago, whether it's in terms of thinking about land reparations for Indigenous folks. There is tremendous harm that institutions of power have perpetrated against marginalized communities, right? Because communities didn't wake up, they didn't enter into being marginalized, right? That happened to them by institutions of power. So this is the kind of harm that we want to focus on addressing through reconciliation. So if we go to the next slide, we can see the theory of reconciliation, and it's really centered around how do we acknowledge and address this institutional harm. So by developing this framework that borrows from elements of restorative practice as known by a lot of First Nations and Indigenous peoples in North America and also New Zealand, looking at transitional justice efforts in areas such as South Africa after apartheid. A number of countries across the world have undertaken truth and reconciliation commissions. But the central idea is, how do we understand, acknowledge, and address institutional harm? So in the context of public safety, we developed this structure to build relationships between these institutions and community members that are founded on mutual trust, empathy, and understanding. And this is really important here because a lot of times we hear from people, all right, well, why can't we just move on? That happened so long ago. That's not the way things are right now. Through the work that you all do, you know full well that is very much in many ways the way that things still are. Sure, and police departments might not be their direct origins now of slave patrols, but there are still many injustices that that occur, right? Sometimes intentionally, and sometimes just by the very design of how our country has been structured, how the criminal justice system is oftentimes the only institution servicing communities of color because of the systematic defunding of social services, of education, and so on, right? So there's a lot to grapple with, and we firmly believe that you can't just throw people in a room together and say, all right, well, let's move on. Everyone here has good intentions. Everyone here wants things to be better. Let's just move forward. We have to acknowledge the past, right? And through this work and through this framework, what we hope to do as well is strengthen legitimacy, the legitimacy that my colleague Paul was just talking through, and reduce violence, right? So we don't believe in strengthening legitimacy for legitimacy's sake. It's not that we're saying, all right, we are undertaking this process only because we want everyone to be huge fans of law enforcement. That's not the premise here. We want people to feel safe. We want people to know that they can access protective resources in their community. We want people who are at risk of joining a group or a gang to know that they don't have to take matters into their own hands. There are other authorities to whom they can go. We want victims to know that if anytime that they are victimized, that they know where they can go to seek resources and to ensure that it doesn't happen again. So that's what we want to see. How the specific forms of how that takes place are up to each community, but it's that principle that we want, where community members know that they can feel safe. And in order to embark on this process, the people with that institutional power have to take the first step. So if we go to the next slide, we can talk through just a little bit more about reconciliation and its restorative underpinnings. So similar to restorative practice, a goal here in reconciliation is to center communities. So Paul talked about procedural justice and how one of the elements of PJ is voice, and do community members feel empowered to share their voice and for that voice to be heard and respected. That's what reconciliation does in practice, right? So it's not just providing a forum for people to speak their voice, but it's ensuring that what they say then shapes how they are served by these institutions. So the main pillars, again, of reconciliation, just like restorative practice, identifying and acknowledging the harm. So what was the harm? Understanding who was harmed, right? And engaging all of these different stakeholders together to figure out how to repair that harm. And I really like this quote from Fania Davis, because sometimes we hear when with regards to the word reconciliation that, you know, what are we reconciling to? Things were never good in the first place. The word can rub people the wrong way. It rubbed me kind of the wrong way at some points when I heard it. But just like reconciliation and restorative, and just the word restorative justice, restorative practice, that gets the same pushback. It's not about returning to the reality, some previous status quo of a time where conflict didn't exist, because we know full well it did. It's about returning to one's best self that's always been there. So it's like returning to an ideal. And I find that really inspiring. So if we go to the next slide, we can also think of how this restorative underpinning of reconciliation affects how it's able to ensure accountability. So traditionally, when we talk about accountability, especially with police departments, we talk about harm that's already occurred, right? So we talk about instituting civilian review boards to to hold disciplinary hearings after an officer has already committed misconduct, committed harm. And these are important. We need measures of back-end accountability. What we also need, which is present in other areas of government in the sense that we have laws that dictate how people are allowed and not allowed to behave. In the context of public safety, that front-end accountability is missing, because the expectations that community members have and the needs that they have of their public safety institutions are not heard in the way that these institutions govern. And we want to change that to make public safety more of a democratic process that is grounded fundamentally in legitimacy, so that the communities who are being served are also shaping the institutions that do this to help prevent harm from occurring in the first place. And that's what we call front-end accountability. So if we go to the next slide, I can just walk through some of these key elements of reconciliation. And as I mentioned, this framework borrows from a number of different practices: indigenous restorative practices, transitional justice efforts across the world. And through all of those different efforts, we sort of landed on 5 key areas that we feel are essential to ensuring a process that respects, of course, the restorative and front-end spirits of the work, and is also going to ensure sustainability and long-term success. So from there, I'll turn over to Paul to start walking us through a few of these.
Absolutely. So police reconciliation, police and community reconciliation, rather, it's a structured process. And in this process, law enforcement and community use this framework to research and develop an understanding of past harms. This could be harms caused by events anywhere from the 1800s to 18 minutes ago. And then taking that understanding and developing that understanding, acknowledging it. And this happens with law enforcement leaders and other public officials to say, look, these are the harms that we have done. We acknowledge these. And these harms could have been done by an institution, as a department, or at times as an individual, or even individual officers. So from there, the listening sessions, where police hear directly from harmed communities, those are a part of this framework, and narrative collection to share personal experiences of harm with the broader community, and we'll talk just a little bit more about that. And ultimately, these work to strengthen legitimacy and reduce violent crime while having an ongoing and collaborative policy and practice change to specify, develop, and implement real and concrete, meaningful change to policy and practice that impact the culture. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll try to unpack a little bit of that understanding of harm and go to the acknowledgement. So with the understanding of harm, for this framework, establishing a consensus of harms done broadly, but deepening that understanding with grounding in the theoretical substratum for the idea of other people's negative experiences with the police, whether those people are a part of one's personal circle or not. They feed into a more general cultural sense of alienation and estrangement from the police. This is a cumulative set of accounts and collective experiences for procedural and really substantive injustices. So legal estrangement theory becomes foundational for legitimacy, both in theory and in practice. And then when you're researching and understanding harm, it also includes developing an understanding of the estrangement and marginalization of communities and how that has impacted those communities and how they've experienced that as well. So then with that is the acknowledgement of harm. This involves a public acknowledgement by law enforcement leadership of the harm they've caused as an institution. And as I said, this could have been caused by individual officers, and this could go back from law enforcement as a whole, dating from when some law enforcement agencies were put together to enforce slave codes, black codes, Jim Crow laws. And with this public acknowledgement is a declared commitment to improvement. So if we could go to the next slide. The next domain in this framework is listening sessions. Listening sessions involve truth telling, but just as important is truth hearing, posturing one's selves and posturing both sides so they can hear the truth and hear people's truths. These sessions are not like town hall meetings with posturing and showboating for sound bites. Instead, they are structured. They're facilitated and coordinated to engage deeply and meaningfully and with respect and focus. And then these listening sessions hope to build relationships founded on the gathering and putting together an aggregating of mutual trust, empathy, and understanding. So if we can go to the next slide. What's just as important and what comes out of these listening sessions is the collection of narratives. This domain seeks to expand the research of reconciliation process by establishing a way to collect and share police and community perspectives with those who are not directly involved in the listening sessions and conversations and group sessions. These narratives are memorialized and disseminated to the broader local public to help build consensus around them. Narratives can be powerful and important, right? And if they are not necessarily factual, but recognize that beliefs matter, right? And often arise from real and painful experiences. So each narrative is someone's truth. And then with this domain, narrative collection also gives officers a chance to share their stories as well. Understanding department narratives helps to work through perceptions that may be problematic for trust building moving forward. And so the narrative collection creates an authoritative account of events that all parties can endorse. And it really establishes a shared record that people can understand, respect, and work from to intentionally develop forward-facing narratives, pivoting away from harmful behaviors and practices. So within narratives are the qualitative data to identify and highlight areas for improvement. This identification can also spur action and continued intentional collaboration. Committing to this process, it demonstrates that a department is willing to face what may be uncomfortable truths, but also demonstrates that the department is willing to build meaningful relationships with an understanding and a respect for the fact that change is necessary. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about policy and practice change, because in building these relationships and to pursue the most impactful policy and practice changes for reconciliation, departments collaboratively, develop and communicate a way to have a commitment to better policing, to implement concrete changes, and to explicitly connect these changes to the broader process of reconciliation in order to impact culture. And when the culture of the department embraces the community and works to enhance the culture of the community, strategies and community norms do not need to wait on national legislation to have impact on hometown policing. And it brings police into the right relationship with communities, to where police are a part of the community and not apart from it. But it also, as my colleague Danielle mentioned, it brings police and community together to the table, whereas before community might have been at the table, but they were on the menu. This process brings them back to the table and gives them a seat at the table, particularly in the conversation of policy, practice change, and forward future thinking in ways to avoid those harmful behaviors that cause the need for that table in the first place. And so if we can go to the next slide. My colleague will talk about goals and practice.
All right, so thank you so much, Paul, for walking through that. And that's our reconciliation framework. As far as what it means to do this work in practice, it has been one of my greatest privileges, honestly, being able to work on design and implementation of this strategy in communities across the country. And you can tell it from the name of our organization, right? It's the National Network of Safe Communities. And we very much see ourselves as that collection of communities across the country. And I think this is important for a number of reasons. One is, Paul just got me thinking about this when he spoke about the fact that when we do this work, you don't have to wait for a national decree to come on down from on high. This is what we're doing grassroots in our own communities. And I think it was PBS NewsHour actually last night that was reflecting on that consistent Gallup poll question about how do Americans feel about race relations. At a national level, consistently over the past several years, they felt pretty poorly about it. But they noticed that the data showed that when people are asked about their own community, there's much more optimism, because there's so much that we can do within our own community. We don't have to wait for DC to codify it for it to be real, right? So doing this work in practice, really what we're able to see is just the ingenuity. I mean, some of those pictures that we showed you as we were ticking through the slides of the elements of the framework, one of those was a note that an officer wrote during a training in the basement of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, which is where 4 little girls were murdered after a racist terrorist bombing, and another girl is severely injured. And this is Birmingham, Alabama, right? Like a lot of us, if we, even I grew up in the South and they didn't want to teach us about any of this stuff, but even we knew what happened in Birmingham. And so it's therefore a little bit disorienting to think, all right, well, how do people there not know the history of their department? How do people serving there not know? One of my good friends actually is a retired captain down there, started his career in the 70s, the early 70s. And when he would go out into Black communities, he wasn't, as a white guy, he didn't understand why people didn't want to talk to him. It's like, Jared, 5 years before, the public safety commissioner had you all fire hoses, and dogs attacking their children. Like, this is that wasn't even history at that point. It was just present. So these stories, it's sometimes amazing to see, but also infuriating, and then also inspiring. There are many different emotions that come with looking at this history, but the point of it is that we don't talk about it enough. We don't acknowledge it enough. And it is essential to understand this history. And that training really spoke to me, because the note that you all saw on the screen was from an officer who wrote, I didn't really understand before, but now I'm sitting here, I'm in the room, I can feel it, and I get it. And so this is what we're talking about, what it looks like in practice, to just help people understand the past and understand that connection between the past and the present, right? Not to say that there aren't enough harms going on in the present to contend with, but understanding that connection is really essential. And the listening sessions, I can say, just having been in the room, listening sessions between intimate partner violence survivors and the police department was really powerful. We believed in having counselors in the room. So you'll see on this slide here, and we talk about some of the goals and best practices. Creating that safe and welcoming space for these listening sessions and narrative sharing is essential, right? So, because it's not like people haven't been telling their stories. The problem is other people in positions of power have not been listening. So we don't want to go in and dig up old wounds and old traumas just for the sake of it, being able to tick off a grant deliverable. That would be inexcusable. What we're trying to do here is finally give those stories the respect and the honor and the impact that they deserve. So it's not just a matter of collecting them for posterity, although that is important. It's using those insights to transform policies and practices, right? And so we find that having different agencies working together, right? The training that I mentioned on history in the 16th Street Baptist Church, that was in partnership with the Civil Rights Institute, right? And the listening sessions I mentioned with intimate partner violence survivors was held at a local family justice center. So building these partnerships are essential for, first of all, doing the work properly, and then also ensuring that it's sustainable, right? You can't just say, all right, well, here's this community body comprised of 10 people who may or may not even get an honorarium and have other full-time jobs, to it's your job to do everything, right? You are simultaneously having lived experiences of harm and committed to this work, personally impacted, institutionally impacted, and it's all up to you to fix it. No, that doesn't work. It has to be a number of groups and agencies and institutions and individuals coming together to do this work, and to make sure that community input is not an afterthought. It is built into how public safety institutions operate. And this can look like, in addition to civilian review boards, having community advisory bodies, not just there to provide occasional input and insight, but where, and I've seen this as well with the police department, before they could roll out a practice, they had to go to their community advisory body to get their input, to revise as needed, to determine how this ought to be messaged and communicated, how the rollout ought to proceed, and then go forward, right? So these are the kinds of fundamental changes we're talking about. It's nothing super dramatic. And again, it doesn't require some sort of announcement from Washington. It's just institutions and community members coming together, all aligned on the premise that this is the new way we need to approach public safety. It's not a program, it's not a grant, it's not some sort of, project, but this is the way that communities deserve to be served. So if we can move to the next slide. Actually, there was something that I wanted to note on the previous one. We talked earlier about the importance of these interagency partnerships and of those having institutional power taking the first step. So it's really, really critical that people in those positions of power have strong buy-in, right? So if you have a chief, you have a mayor, they can't be milquetoast or lukewarm about this. They have to be all in. And whatever it takes to get them all in, as Paul loves to say, whatever yes needs to look like, let's make that happen. because this is important. This requires strong leadership. All right, so thank you, Cam. We can go to the next slide now. So yeah, just wrapping this up here, because we'd love to hear some of your thoughts. But overall, just want to reinforce that reconciliation is a practice that overall is grounded in restorative approaches, which means centering the needs and the voices and the agency of communities, understanding the harm that has taken place and naming that, right? Honoring the people who've been harmed and working together to figure out how to repair that harm. And a core element of restorative practice is about, when we talk about harm, who has been harmed, who has caused harm, we're trying to move away from some of the more destructive and dehumanizing labels, right? Because in the community, people say, oh, they're a victim, or, oh, that person's just a perp or an offender. People are more than the worst that they've ever done. We do fundamentally believe that. In the same way that, we work in our violence preventions with people who have taken lives and can work to get them on a path where they change, where they give back to their community, where they support their community and they become whole. That's the approach that we're trying to take to this institutional harm as well. And we fundamentally believe that by making this a more participatory process where community input and community intent is shaped into the very fabric of how these institutions operate, we can ensure a type of front-end accountability that's proactive and can help reduce and prevent harm before it occurs. Our specific framework for reconciliation in this police community context centers on 5 main elements. We have our acknowledgement of harm. As Paul mentioned, needs to be public facing and sincere and specific. The fact-finding work or research about historical and present harm that's necessary to understand what we're talking about. The listening sessions, where we foster that environment for people to speak and for people to share and have those experiences honored. Narrative collection, where we expand that effort. And policy and practice change, where we incorporate those insights into transforming public safety. And that can be as big as, major shifts to the department, creating new divisions, et cetera, creating new policies. It can be as small as one thing that came out of a listening session I went to, where they simply changed how protective orders were stored because they didn't realize the impact it was having to victims when they called 911, right? So, trust isn't necessarily built with these big grand gestures. Sometimes it's built by small, concrete, relevant, reparative actions where you build people's trust and you keep your word. And ultimately, we do this. Yes, it helps reduce violence. Yes, there are a number of benefits. Ultimately, it's the right thing to do. People who've been harmed deserve to have that harm acknowledged, addressed, and repaired. So with that, I believe that's our presentation. We have on the next slide some additional resources. And then I think on the next slide after that, our contact information. You all are more than welcome to reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. And I think with, is it 15, 17 minutes? I would love to hear some questions. So over to you, Cam.
Thank you so much for that presentation. We do have some questions for both of you. So let me pull those up here. We'll jump into those. So using a single city where you engaged in or facilitated the reconciliation process, can you describe step by step what the process entailed, how many sessions, what each session consisted of, who was invited to the sessions, what are the challenges in a large city with millions of residents compared to a smaller city? Can you just, I think they're looking for some details about a specific case or event in a city.
Sure. So I think there are 2 questions in there. And so the first one in regards to just what the process looks like, it really varies from city to city. We come in with just sort of the building blocks of the framework, and then how this often connects to different initiatives that communities may already have underway. All right, so our job isn't to come in as the John Jay researchers and supplant anything. It's to offer a framework that they can use to help organize some of their existing thoughts and practices. So for this work, typically we work with the partners to establish a governance structure for this work to understand who's going to be involved, some sort of site liaison or project manager who can be responsible for day-to-day strategic planning and coordination of different events and meetings. And trust me, there are a lot of meetings, which are important because we want to make sure that people have the opportunity to share their voice and to share their input in the design of this framework. So we share as much as we can about the reconciliation framework and hear feedback and hear the community's goals for what they would like to see, and then work with them to design specific deliverables that both, of course, honor the fidelity to this framework, but even more importantly, their specific goals for their community. And some communities perhaps have not grappled with the past, and that therefore the fact-finding piece just takes that much more precedence for them. It's really, really important for them to spend a lot of time there. For some communities, perhaps they've done some of that work. The question is, all right, we have all these recommendations and research now, how do we do something about it? So we might focus a bit more on the policy and practice change. As far as listening sessions go, there are some things that are kind of standard rules in the sense that we like to keep them fairly intimate. We don't want some sort of town hall format of a bunch of people in the room. We do like a facilitated conversation, roughly, say ideally 15 to 20, but I've seen them smaller, I've seen them larger, still just as powerful. And, in regards to the policy and practice changes, people will take notes from those listening sessions, confidential and anonymous. But the one that I mentioned about storing protective orders, survivors shared that responding patrol officers didn't have their protective orders on file and kept asking them for it, which is really frustrating after you've gone through all the hassle of filing a protective order. And they realized, all right, well, this is an IT issue. So they circled back to IT, shared this with the chief and just made sure within the department to make this happen, and then reported back on the progress at the next listening session. So I can share different examples of how it's done. I don't want to share too many because that take a very long time, but those are some of the different ways it can look. As far as a small city versus a large one, it really just depends on, I think, how well the community groups can be mobilized and how willing they are to work together. I think in smaller communities, sometimes it's just a little bit more manageable. When I say smaller, I mean talking up to like 250,000. So I'm not sure how that varies across different areas of the country. I mean, I'm in New York, and it's obviously orders of magnitude much larger than that. But it's a matter of really defining community. You don't have to say just because you're from West Palm Beach, Florida, that you have to do reconciliation for the entire municipality or metropolitan statistical area. It's all right, well, what is our community, right? Is it this specific area, is this specific neighborhood, right? And what can we do there, right? So just focusing on that, you can not only make an impact in your neighborhood, but set an example and set a precedent that's really powerful for other people to look to and expand the work from there.
Thank you for that, Danielle. In addition, in the cities in which you were involved in reconciliation framework, what was before and after polling results regarding trust in police, feeling that the police are legitimate?
So it varied. We worked in, when we did this project under a US DOJ grant, we worked with 6 cities across the country. So we can share that. I think we might be able to share it with all of you. I'm not sure, but or in the chat, we can definitely make sure it's sent out. But there was an evaluation published by the Urban Institute 2 years ago that walked through all of the results in detail. What we did find, though, were attitudinal shifts within the police department towards community members, positive attitudinal shifts, And we also found from the community members themselves as well, shifts in their perceptions of trust and legitimacy. So that the data that Paul showed earlier in the presentation was a baseline survey conducted prior to implementation, and they measured that against surveys taken later and sometimes towards the end of implementation, and found some changes, some positive changes.
Great. Next, we have a question on any tips on how we can help institutional representatives accept the genuine feelings and perceptions of the community about harm without just being defensive. That seems to require real culture change and can't be modeled by institutional leadership alone.
Yeah, that is, it's a practice. As I said, part of the conversation is truth telling, but it's also truth hearing. And this is facilitated, and before you just bring folks together and say, all right, y'all sit down and talk, there is some capacity building for listening, for posturing oneself without being defensive, and being able to sit and hear and listen, and the responses that come from what you hear, instead of saying, yeah, thanks for sharing, it's more, we appreciate this, we needed this information, we'll take this information and build on it. And then from that, developing a respect and a consensus around the narratives that are shared. Taking those, because as we said earlier, there's someone's truth. And when you have that someone's truth, it's on the table, it means everything to them. And respecting the fact that it happened, it matters, here's how they processed it, rather than going back and saying, well, here are the actual facts, it is their actual truth. And then being able to respect that. And for NACOLE, for oversight committees, for folks who say, you know, we would like to have a part in this process, instead of being the oversight committee who just gives references up, helping to navigate this process, helping to coordinate this process, because there's data behind it, and then giving a true understanding of, we spoke briefly about the legal estrangement that communities have experienced. Legitimacy cannot stand alone without standing on the platform of the understanding that communities have felt and been estranged or really divorced from the processes that should have involved their input, and then helping folks when they come together in those small settings, helping side A understand that these are the things you may hear, posture yourself to hear it without rattling off, instead of waiting for someone to finish, actually listen to them, and without rattling off, here are my defensive clauses, here are my defensive retorts. These sessions do not engender the ability to just give retorts, because then you're in an argument. But being able to hear the truth, take that, and take those and just generating that consensus, that collection of narratives that everyone can say, these are their truths, these are our truths. Collectively, we can endorse these and stand on these to develop policies so that these narratives, when we pivot away from the things and the harms that and the abuses that could have caused these narratives have helped to establish policy changes and help to establish local understanding and respect for these, so that, as we said, you're not waiting on the legislators to do this. This is hometown policing. This is hometown public safety. And when the community owns this, the community is a part of developing it. We work and walk together hand in hand, so folks can have an ability, when you're asking what does yes need to look like, here's what your yes needs to look like. Hear us, let's hear you, let's walk together and make this happen. And then from that, there's an ability for communities to work together with law enforcement and improve public safety. So instead of waving the flag of defund the police, full stop, it's more about improving public safety with public safety. So that oversight committee can have a hand in helping to navigate these processes and bringing folks together.
Thank you, Paul. That is incredibly helpful. Another person has asked, is this designed specifically for police and community relations, or is it available for other segments of the community? More specifically, those organizations that are city, state, or federally funded.
I'll say a little bit and then I'll hand it to my colleague Danielle. Yes, this can be used in other settings. This can be used for marginalized communities and communities within communities, communities within organizations. That the principles hold true. And what you'll find is that, you know, individuals don't just have one truth. And no individual or no set of individuals is the whole community. They may be representative of communities, but because we have different truths within us, you may have someone who says, well, I'm Black and Black Lives Matter, but I'm also part of the LGBTQ community. So when you have those institutions and those communities within communities, this can be handled at the corporate level. This can be taken, and I mentioned legal estrangement earlier. Legal estrangement doesn't just happen with police. This happens with the courts. This happens with prosecutors. I've even heard people say that the folks who examine the body, the medical examiners, were in on this, whatever this is. So this can be used collectively to help with the institution and with institutions that house institutions. Danielle, what do you think?
I mean, you said it perfectly, and really appreciate you just elevating the importance of intersectionality here, because oftentimes when we do this work, we're talking about race, and oftentimes specifically with Black communities, but Black communities are not a monolith, and people who belong to Black communities belong to a number of other communities. We can be Black and we can be survivors of domestic violence. We can be Black, as Paul mentioned, LGBTQ+. There are many, many, many different identities, and therefore it's not just about one specific context. We tend to focus a little bit more on police community reconciliation because of our origins as a public safety organization and working a lot with law enforcement and to transform the way that law enforcement approaches violence prevention. But by no means is this restricted. I mean, we borrow this work from indigenous community practices that have nothing oftentimes to do with specific formal government institution, and from international organizations looking to address human rights violations, a number of different issues, right? So this is extremely adaptable, and that's why we call it a framework instead of a model. We don't want to come in with some sort of cookie cutter thing, but we want to come in a way that truly listens to and respects the goals and the needs of a given community. So we ourselves have adapted it to a number of different contexts, and we really look forward to seeing what people are able to do. And please do not hesitate to reach out to us for any additional guidance or thoughts or advising on how to approach reconciliation.
If I could add one more thing, Cami.
Absolutely.
I would encourage oversight committees, oversight groups, and sometimes oversight committees could be a committee of one. I would encourage folks who are looking to take a framework that says, here we have oversight over. This process, this framework allows folks to come alongside with instead of hovering over. And when you come alongside with, and we, even as the folks who advise this, we don't try to be that sage on the stage that beats folks over the head with the knowledge and what we know. We try to be the guide on the side. And when you work these initiatives together, it engenders and fosters hope. And it helps individuals to know that when you have an oversight to where it can be combative, when we work together and intentionally stay alongside and continuously have these conversations, it helps bring down the tensions, and it really helps to level the playing field. And again, as I said, it brings folks to the table together in a round table where there are no big eyes or little U's, but the framework allows for continuous improvement and sustainability, and you don't sustain it as it is, you sustain it through its evolutions, because times change, people change, things change, and thinking changes, as well as taking this and impacting a culture, because ultimately culture eats strategy and practices and all that for lunch. But taking strategy, practices, and policies on the table, they become the lunch of the culture.
Thank you. And I think that's an excellent place to end, because unfortunately we've run out of time. But we did have quite a few questions still in the queue. I just want to let everyone know that we will forward those on so that we can seek answers for some of your questions, so we haven't forgotten about you as your question is lingering in the queue right now. But with that, I just want to extend my sincere appreciation and gratitude for both of you being here today, your willingness to share your knowledge and information with us, and tell us a little bit about the great work that you're doing. I also have to take a moment to thank Janine Zajac, who from the Philadelphia Police Advisory Commission and a member of the NACOLE Training and Education and Standards Committee, who put this session for us together for us today. So thank you very much, Janine. NACOLE cannot do what it does without those who are willing to share their information and knowledge with the oversight community and those that help put this valuable programming together. So with that said, registration, I wanted to let you all know that registration is open for the next webinar in this year's series. On June 9th, we will welcome Dr. Robin Engel from the University of Cincinnati, who will discuss the role of first-line supervisors in promoting organizational change. And I see some nice nods there from our speakers today about the next one. And soon we'll be opening registration for our 27th annual conference, which will be presented in two parts. The virtual conference will include 32 webinars and will begin on August 16th. The in-person component of the conference will take place in Tucson, Arizona from December 12th through the 16th and will include 20 additional sessions. Please watch your inboxes as additional information will be sent out shortly. It has been a pleasure being with you today, and I look forward to being with all of you at our next event. Thank you very much.
Take care, folks.